Hello, my name is Nicholas Morton, and in this talk I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the commercial networks of the Near East at the time of the medieval period, specifically the Crusades. And within this we're going to be looking at two main groups of trade route, both the international trade routes and then afterwards we're going to be looking at local trade routes. So to begin, international trade routes. You've probably heard of the Silk Roads. Now the Silk Roads are not just a small number of roads, they're a whole network of different caravan routes connecting much of Central and Eastern Asia with the Near East. Many of them start in China or Central Asia, bringing goods like silk, but also many other items as well. It has to be said specifically textiles in many cases, from China and Central Asia, and then through Persia, often south of the Caspian Sea, and then round through what today would be modern day Iraq and Syria, and then up north to avoid the Syrian desert, crossing the river Euphrates, and then entering the western part of Syria. Now many of these caravans will have as a stopping point or as a market the city of Aleppo in northern Syria. Crucial market, major city, very important mercantile emporium, and from there those traders could either take their goods to the coast, to ports like Latakia near Antioch, or they could swing south to Damascus, again another very large city, major market, major sort of trading centre, and from there they could then again go to the coast, perhaps to the cities of Tripoli, Tyre or Acre. In some cases those caravans don't stop in Damascus or even go to the coast, they'll go further south through the Sinai Desert until they finally reach Egypt, where they'll then go to the Egyptian ports, either for the goods to be sold or to be sold into the Mediterranean trade. And so that very broadly is the main paths of the Silk Road through the medieval period. But you may have noticed that one of the key features of this is that in order to complete that kind of journey, merchants will have to travel through many different territories. And so let's say a merchant is completing a journey in, say, the 1110s. That merchant will arrive over having crossed the Euphrates at Aleppo and then have to move west. So let's say they want to go to the port of Latakia. They'll then have to go from Aleppo, which is ruled by the Seljuk dynasty, into Antioch, which is one of the Crusader states. And so many of the trade routes in this area, they actually cross through very different territories, including territories which are occasionally or frequently at war. And so it forms an important part of the geopolitics of the region, the need to keep the trade routes open, because everyone profits from the trade route, so it's in everyone's interests to make sure that they remain available to merchants. And in fact there's a fascinating account by a Muslim pilgrim called Ibn Jubayr, and he actually notices that even at time of war, when various territories were fighting one another, merchants were generally able to travel across the embattled territory freely, because everyone realised it wasn't in their interests to impede that trade. And he was talking in particular about the wars between Saladin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem in his particular account. But these trade routes don't remain the same. Over time they begin to shift, and one of these key shifts occurs in the 13th century with the advent of the Mongols. And the Mongols conquer much of the Near East, and one of their key battlegrounds is the river Euphrates, which from the 1260s onwards becomes very heavily contested between the Mongols and the Mamluk Empire. And the Mamluks control Syria to the west of the Euphrates and then down from there into Egypt. Now because the river Euphrates becomes a major battle zone, that means it's not easy for merchants to travel across the river Euphrates and then down to places like Aleppo and Damascus. And so as a result, the trade routes swing north through what today would be modern day Turkey. In this period it would have been referred to as Anatolia. And so they go through Anatolia and then terminate at various ports such as Ayas in Cilician Armenia or Antalya in what today would be modern day Turkey. And so trade routes do change over time, and certainly warfare can be a major block, unless of course arrangements are in place, as I've mentioned already, to allow that trade to take place even when people are fighting. Another group of trade routes include those that come down from the Black Sea. Now, products from that region can include things like furs and grain, among other products, and they are often shipped from the Crimea across the Black Sea, either to the ports of northern Anatolia or through the Bosphorus. And the Bosphorus is the crucial sea lane that connects the Black Sea to the Aegean and therefore into the Mediterranean. It's the only way to get a ship from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, so it's an incredibly important seaway. And the city of Constantinople, which is the major capital of the Byzantine Empire, sits on that sea lane, which goes some way to explaining why Constantinople is so important and indeed lucrative, because of course that trade can be taxed. So those are two routes by which goods get from the Black Sea region further south into the Near East. Some goods are carried by land or perhaps by ship to the southeast part of the Black Sea, and then carried by land to cities like Tabriz and then further south into the Near East. But my point is, you have that north-south route as well, which it forms an important part of the area's commercial network. And then another really big group of international trade routes are the spice routes. And these bring items such as cinnamon, ginger, pepper, nutmeg, precious stones from Southeast Asia and India, across the northern Indian Ocean, and then up to the east coast of Egypt, where they're then carried either by caravan or sometimes by canal. Egypt has a very developed network of canals in this period, to the northern ports, places like Alexandria or Damietta, where they're then sold into the Mediterranean trade. Other goods go up the Persian Gulf, where they're then sold in places like Baghdad before being traded further north. So there are various different legs of that particular route, but that too is enormously profitable and enormously important trade route in the area. And then finally, there are the trans-Saharan gold routes, bringing gold as well as various other items such as ivory from sub-Saharan Africa up typically into Egypt, where again they're sold into the Mediterranean trade or indeed to elsewhere. So this is just a whistle-stop tour of the international trade routes of this era, but I'm hoping you can see just how complicated they are and just how many, often very valuable, goods are being brought into the region. Now, something to observe about the goods that are traded over very long distances is that often they are very high value but relatively low weight, and there's a reason for that, in that the transport costs to bring goods over such vast distances are very high. So the only thing you're going to be able to sell to a high profit is goods that have a very high value but can be carried relatively easily. More bulky goods like grain or vegetables, these are nearly always traded locally. Of course, some goods, particularly those that are brought by ship, can be transported in fairly large quantities, and this brings me on to the last of the major international trade routes I'm going to discuss here, and that is goods brought to the Near East from Western Christendom. Now, these include a wide range of products. Western Christendom was fairly well known for things like textiles, weapons and armour, foodstuffs and cheese, but also birds of prey, which were particularly prized across many of the areas of the Near East. And so there too, these are goods that are often being exchanged for goods that are sold into the Mediterranean trade from elsewhere. But you can see just how important the Near East is. It really is a fulcrum in the trade routes, combining all sorts of different areas of Eurasia, but also Africa as well. So let's now move on to local trade. Now, the Near East contains many important cities. I've mentioned Damascus and Aleppo already. There's also other big trading and mercantile cities like Acre and Tyre and Tripoli. And these are important not just as markets, not just as waypoints for traders. They produce a great deal of manufactured products and agricultural goods as well. And just to pull out a few examples, Damascus was famous for its arms and for fruit and textiles. Acre was famous for its glass. Antioch was famous for a range of products, but perhaps most unusually for its eels from a nearby lake. St. Simeon, which is a port very close to Antioch. It was famous for its ceramics. Aleppo for textiles. The port city of Tyre was famous for a purple dye that was extracted from local sea snails. And there's also the question of raw materials. Now, I mentioned in a previous talk that the Near East doesn't have large areas of woodland, but there are some. And of course, because woodland and therefore timber is fairly scarce, that means it's in high demand. And so the Cilician mountains of the north, that's the Amanus and Taurus mountains, these have thickly wooded slopes which have good quality building timber, not just for houses and castles and religious buildings, but also for maritime architecture, ships. And that makes timber from this area extremely valuable. Other areas of timber include, for example, the famous Lebanese cedars in the mountains of Lebanon, which again were highly prized. Because timber is not particularly prolific across the area, that gives areas with woodland, or particularly woodland with good quality timber, which can be created into very large bulks of timber, that makes these areas extremely important commercially, but also geopolitically. And so it is a notable feature of diplomacy and warfare at this time that a great deal of emphasis is placed on the control of these areas, or at least the control of trade in these areas. And to give you an idea of just how badly some areas needed good quality timber, one of the clauses in the surrender agreement of the Fifth Crusade in 1221 was that the Fifth Crusaders would leave behind some spare masts for their ships, because the Egyptian authorities wanted those masts for their own vessels, because timber, particularly so very long bulks of timber suitable for ships' masts, were simply not that easy to get hold of. Another crucial commodity that was fairly scarce across the area is iron. Many areas in the Near East simply do not have good deposits of iron, but again, that changes in the north, where again in areas like Cilicia there are large deposits of iron, and so that too adds a new dimension to trade in the area. And many trading agreements, many diplomatic agreements, again, often specify or try to protect the trade in iron, because the Cilician Armenians have it, but many other regions want it. And so that forms, again, a crucial part of the geopolitics of the area. Another important product with considerable political importance is grain. Now, as I mentioned in a previous talk, the key grain producing areas in the Near East are the Nile Delta, the coastal strip of the Levant, but also a few inland regions such as the Hauran. And it's notable that a lot of the raiding activity of this era takes place in those agricultural areas, because of course food is very important. All rulers have got to feed their people, and so if you can control the food supply, or if you can deny it from your enemies, that then can be a very potent economic and military weapon. And so it's worth being aware of that and where the main areas of food cultivation are across the area. Now, another really important crop grown in the Near East is sugar, or sugar cane to be more precise. And this is grown in a number of regions in the Near East, often those with the best access to water or with the highest levels of precipitation. And so that would include areas like the coastal region of the Levant and some parts of Egypt as well. Now, sugar in this period commands an enormous price. And so the ability to sell sugar, particularly into, say, the Mediterranean trade, that can be an extremely valuable commercial product. And many areas around the periphery of the Mediterranean are prepared to pay a very, very high price for that sugar. So it becomes a crucial commodity. And just to take one example, we know that the Knights Hospitaller and Knights Templar went to great lengths to cultivate sugar cane on their estates in order to fund their other activities across the Near Eastern region. That's just one example among many. There are many other studies that have shown sugar being cultivated intensively and increasingly as the medieval period went on. So what do we make of all of this? I think the overall point that is made by all these various factors is just how enormously important the Near Eastern region was from a commercial perspective, and by extension, just how much money local rulers could gain in income and revenue by taxing that trade. And so we know, for example, that one pilgrim reported that the city of Acre, which for a long period was in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, provided its ruler with revenue of £50,000 of silver, an enormous sum of money. Damascus was apparently worth 3 times that amount for its ruler. And that just gives you an idea of the sheer scale of the money we're talking about. Now, either of those revenues, either for Acre or Damascus, would probably be several times higher than, for example, a ruler in Western Christendom at this time. So we're talking about enormous sums of money, particularly when it's compared to other regions in the medieval world at this time. And of course, control over those trade routes means that in itself will be an incentive for war, an incentive for peace in some cases, and often an incentive for diplomacy in others. Okay, so I hope you found this interesting and got a clear overview of the basics, at least, of the commercial networks of the Near East during the medieval period. Thank you.